Don't be alarmed. It's only the death breath of the Dark Lord. Don't be scared. It's only an Imperial cruiser making the jump to light speed. Relax. It's only...
The best way to spend Mardi Gras! Come join C4SS and Crew Domain for a carnival celebration you'll never forget. 1 part Anarchist Book Fair and Unconference and 1 part Cultural and Arts Festival, Coup de Gras features guest speakers, live music, drag, stand-up comedy, parades, an agorist market, and so much more. Join us February 17th to 22nd, 2023 at Fontainebleau State Park. Visit coupdegras.wtf for more details. That's COUPDEGRAS.WTF.
Hello, and welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio. This is Alex McHugh, and what follows is an interview I recorded with Ash P. Morgans. Ash is a writer who contributed to our recent Mutual Exchange Symposium on Egoism and Anarchism. They describe themselves as a friend of de Jacques, and in their own words, they are a tagless queer radical who, like the Wonderland cat they admire, grins like a maniac and refuses to exist for very long. An anarchist so without adjectives as to drop the without adjectives part because they were egoistic enough to find it annoying, and who dropped the egoist tag for the same reason. They have a deep interest in Stirner, roots in Marx, and at least one eye toward Proudhon. They are interested in a broad array of thought with focuses on discourse and materialisms, theories of change, riot, and unrest, and the evolution of government, authority, and the state. If you haven't checked out the full symposium on egoism and anarchism yet, it's still up on the site, and our conversation here references the series of essays written by Jason Lee Bias for that symposium and the responses by Ash. Ash and I also discuss the state of scholarship on egoism, how egoism relates to religion, which was a popular topic in the symposium in general, and a few other topics at the nexus of anarchism and egoism. A quick note, there are a few places where Ash refers to Andrew Craig's essay in the symposium. This is actually Alex or Alexander Craig, so please make a note of that. And if you haven't read the full symposium yet, I would highly recommend it. It was a really enjoyable back and forth, and I'm excited to be able to cap it off with this interview. So this was a really fun one for me to record as someone interested in egoism in general, and I hope you all enjoy this conversation as much as I did recording it. And so with that, thank you for joining me today, Ash. Is there anything more you want to let the listeners know about yourself?
Not really anything that you haven't already mentioned. I am a vicious nerd and no authority on anything.
Wonderful. Vicious is not one I usually hear associated with nerd, but I think I get what you mean there. So yeah, I was really excited to read your essays in the Mutual Exchange Symposium that we did on anarchism and egoism, responding to a couple of different essays, but mostly Jason Lee Bias's essays on anarchism and egoism, and sort of his were in favor of moralism. Although one of the interesting things I want to get into later is how in the first one he does kind of agree with the egoists. So we can talk about that later. But the first question that I wanted to ask, and I think this is kind of central to Stirner's project, to egoism as a project, to this whole sort of approach to critique that Stirner exemplifies and egoists exemplify. And so the question is, what is the role of humor, of sarcasm, and what the British would call taking the piss, is the phrase that keeps coming into mind whenever I read Stirner. What's the role of this tone in Stirner's work and that of his followers?
Yeah, so that's a really fantastic question, because as you said, it is really a central aspect, particularly to Stirner's own writing. That sort of philosophical piss taking. It really is like a key feature of how he approaches his arguments. Especially as he gets in later in The Unique in Its Property, onto his later section on self-enjoyment and joy and jubilation and consumption. The Unique in Its Property as a book itself, the structure is a parody. I think of Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity. His opening section, humanity, and especially the hierarchy in that is focus on his focus on history is a parody of Hegel's historical narrative. I've even heard it argued that the title of the book is ironic, that like the phrase "the unique" is a play on other Hegelian terms. Like the first one that comes to my mind is the world historical individual as sort of like the unique, this abstract when the unique can't be abstract. It's inherently this word to denote the most particular of particulars, or even that it has its property, as if that's also like a fixed thing you can understand. And so even the structure of the book is kind of a joke. The name can be argued to be almost ironic. And that plays a role in how Stirner is looking at ideas themselves. When you look at, what he would call a fixed idea, or sort of like something that is sacred, an aspect of that is that we're meant to think about these ideas in a particular way. If you have God or Jesus Christ or capital R reason, these things are presented as important. They're supposed to be revered, cherished, mulled over, thought about in a certain way. And so even in approaching the idea, it's not just the idea of itself, but how the relationship you're supposed to have to it. And so in laughing at the sacred, in taking a swig of sacramental wine, Stirner is really criticizing that line of thinking directly. I think he actually points it out very specifically as so what if I laugh at God when I'm supposed to revere him? And it ties into so many other aspects of his thinking, and also conclusions that we can draw. With philosophy, in quotes, for example, rather than searching for inherent meaning or some higher truth, philosophy becomes one potential mode of our own enjoyment. It's something that we can use. It's a joke that we play on other philosophers. It's something that's potentially useful and that we can discard when we're done with it. And so so in sort of challenging that relationship we have to ideas, it allows him to, I guess, break out of really fixed confines of what it is we're doing when we're thinking critically and what things we could otherwise be doing. He gets into it in Stirner's Critics, this notion of thoughtlessness, of simply taking in the world without creating concepts to describe it, of allowing things to happen. Even, I'm trying to think, I believe it was Philosophical Reactionaries, that sort of last essay that he had written, where he points out that writing The Unique in Its Property was just the happiest time of his life. And so even as an author, the philosophy that or the mode of thinking that he's taking on as an author, is one of writing because not in order to elucidate some higher truth, but because it is something that he finds enjoyable. And so the sort of like all-encompassing humor that you find everywhere in his work is kind of pointing to this wildly different relationship that he wants to try and have to what he's doing, what he's thinking, why he's doing it. I have here in my notes one of his quotes. I sing because I am a singer, but I use you for it because I need ears. And so it's really highlighting just the different ways that we can, and oftentimes almost already do, think about the things that we're doing. Which is a really roundabout way of answering the question, but those are my general thoughts on the topic.
No, I appreciate, the roundabout answer, because one of the things I really appreciated about your essays is sort of taking on this tone of having fun with it, and I think it's sort of a lost art. And one of the things that makes Stirner so hard to understand, allows for so many misinterpretations and misunderstandings, is that he's writing in this extremely convoluted parody upon parody. What you were mentioning with even the title of the book, we're not sure if it's a parody or not. And I think, there's a lot to be gained from that, in the way you were saying of like, we don't know what's possible for us to find, for us to learn, for us to discover, if we don't go all these different ways, if we don't play, right? And I think there's a lot of different ways to think about philosophy as an action, right? As a thing that humans do. And one of them is very serious, right? It's considering the most deep questions that we have about what we are and who we are and all of this. But I think another approach that Stirner is not the only thinker to have taken is it's a form of play. We're playing with language. We're playing with understanding. We're playing with each other, with other philosophers. Like you said, we're playing jokes on each other, in a way that is enjoyable. And through that enjoyment and like actual interest, we unlock this ability to, discover things. So yeah, I really appreciate, you're returning to that tone in your essays, and also talking about, where this fits into the larger endeavor of philosophy, just now. And it might be worth saying a little more about Stirner's thoughts on philosophy as an endeavor, where he fits into all of that, because I think that's another place where a lot of confusion happens, because people go and read Stirner as if you would Hegel. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you have anything more to say about how he fits in with these other philosophers of the time, with the tradition of philosophy in general.
That's also a really good question. Wow. I can only comment so much on that. I had mentioned it to a friend of mine who's really very much so into philosophy, is that I've gotten into a lot of this kind of thinking, and a lot of these other authors from Hegel to Camus, or basically anyone that I've read. I've done it in a very roundabout way, is that I encountered Stirner first, and now I'm considering reading Hegel. Now I've started reading, The Myth of Sisyphus. Now I'm interested in other thinkers, Heidegger or Descartes. So I've gone about it in a really roundabout way, or kind of done it backwards. And so when it comes to Stirner's relationship to them, I can only comment so much. I guess in the sense of philosophy as trying to answer a question, Stirner fits in, if we're thinking about it as sort of like us finding a problem and trying to solve it, or trying to interpret something, or come to some kind of conclusion, Stirner there as a thinker is one who's looking at it as I'm trying to think of a way to word this. Oh, he's almost pointing out all of the different ways that we can sort of try and approach these different problems. If sort of looking, he would focus on a philosopher's relationship to the act of philosophizing in that sense. So if instead of trying to, I guess, articulate something that his audience has to believe, he's looking at it more from the perspective of a kind of method of, almost asking yourself, what can I do? What are all the possible ways that I can just get the most out of life? Or what am I capable of doing? How can I approach these problems? What is my relation to my thinking? If my it really challenges how we would usually think about philosophy if we think about philosophy as something to be used, like a tool.
Yeah, no, I really like that that way of putting it. He's looking at it as a tool. It's one of the things in the toolbox, and it's something that individuals use for our own ends, our own interests. So I guess with that, we've talked about the role of humor, sarcasm, parody, this sort of, edgy take on philosophy. One of the questions that came up for me a lot reading Stirner's work, reading others on his work, is, I guess, a confusion around what the initial claims of ego in its own are. I think, there's a lot to say here. We're going to get into this whole discussion about what is morality, what is amorality, what does Stirner say? We're going to get into this in a second. But I think taking even a step back from that, there's a question as to whether he's saying anything normative, the world should be this way, or is merely making empirical claims, or I guess, in the philosophical terms, metaphysical claims about what is. And I think it's an interesting question to look at. And so I wanted to ask that before we get too deep into other things. Do you think he's saying something normative or merely making sort of an empirical or metaphysical claim about what is?
So, yeah, you are right in pointing out that is one thing that many people have found difficult with Stirner's writings. And I think it comes down to the fact that Stirner opens his book by making explicit value judgments. And so he kind of dances this fine line between value ridden and more like blanket empirical statements. One of the ways that he opens his book is with the statement, won't you learn from these shining examples that the egoist gets on best? I, for my part, take a lesson from them. I would prefer to be the egoist myself. And so in the claims that he's making, he is explicitly saying, like, hey, the conclusions that I'm coming to are the conclusions that I like. But it would be, I think, disingenuous or wrong to say this is how things ought to be. Or as if his statements or his conclusions are the end all be all, that these are the conclusions that we must draw from the world around us. The actual claims that he's making, egoism, involuntary egoism, the egoist, and then the unique, I might refrain from, at least for now, going too deep into those because they tie into how he's sort of inverting the narratives presented in Hegel and the young Hegelians, which I just don't know enough about, unfortunately. But yeah. One way we can also think about this sort of, going back to that point to what we just said on humor, actually, for example, a friend of mine had said it really well, that he had essentially pointed out that Stirner constructs this whole system, this whole language of the unique and the nothing and voluntary egoism and so on, immediately in his own argument to basically turn around and essentially say it's all worthless. You as the reader can toss it all aside if you so desire. Truths are herbs and weeds, which is up to me. And so when we look at sort of the work that he's put forward already in terms of, value judgments, he's mainly, at least for me, talking about one series of conclusions that you could draw, one form of enjoyment that we can sort of talk about. His focus on enjoyment is more indicative of his larger ideas on sacred thinking as a denial of that enjoyment. And so, if we're supposed to think about the world in particular ways and, then immediately berate ourselves when we inevitably fail, all the ways that we come to enjoy the world fall to the wayside. But, what Stirner is arguing is that, the egoist who has nothing higher has no such problem. If we then, profane what is sacred, he kind of presents his ideas almost as if, what else is there left to do if we're not just going to be living anymore, or, seeing life itself as this sacred and fixed thing which must be preserved, but instead as something which is squandered and used. And, my heart is beating, my blood is pumping. I am something that I'm constantly devouring, in his words, that I'm constantly using myself and using the world and enjoying it, savoring it. He uses a lot of words related to food, as if this is something that we're eating. I think he actually literally calls people food at some point, which
I think yeah, there was some. I do remember encountering people who thought that was literal as well at some point. So it must be
cannibal.
Yeah, it must be some metaphor that he uses somewhere.
But yeah, and so even if even if all of that is sort of a rough statement of what the world is, I would think it'd be very sort of incorrect to say that, this is how the world ought to be. We should all be egoists. Which doesn't really work. Because for Stirner, we're all egoists all the time. Whenever you have a fixed idea, you're always a sinner against it. For Catholics, you're always a sinner. For Feuerbach's humanism, you're always an egoist. You will never be the ideal that you pursue. And so, in that sense, or like one of the main ideas, egoism as like the term that he's using, very much so is not a normative claim. It's sort of it's a way that we think about ourselves. Either we're profane, or we're always profane, and that's bad, or we're always profane, and we vibe from we vibe from there. I forgot what secondary source it was, but they had articulated one idea really well, that Stirnerians most often approach Stirner as sort of a source of inspiration and pleasure. We are inspired by it. We want to read him, or sometimes we don't want to read him. We find sometimes just personal usefulness and enjoyment in his work. So of the claims that he's making, he's clearly making value judgments on them. He wants you to be an egoist, but that's less like, you have to be this thing. You have to think about the world the way he is thinking about it. And when I say he wants you to be an egoist, he wants you to be conscious of it. He wants you to, be profane and aware of it, and then be able to move on from these fixed ideas. But almost in the sense of him singing only because he wants to sing. He thinks that if you're not just living, you might as well enjoy as well. So I guess not normative, but very value ridden is my again.
Yeah, and I think this is something we can talk about more maybe in a minute. Is this idea of values and morality being not necessarily the same thing, and having value judgments that might not be morality. But maybe are, and I think that's sort of what I see as one of the best, one of the strongest critiques, right? Is this like, if there is something normative being said here, there clearly are value judgments being made here. Why are these not morality? But I don't know. Do you want to get into that now, or the questions we had planned?
I have time. We can definitely get into that. That is, it comes down, one of the biggest issues, particularly my first essays of really approaching bias, was.
I just want to clarify, that's Jason Lee Bias.
Jason Lee Bias. Yeah, sorry, I should have specified that at the beginning.
You got to say his whole name, because otherwise it sounds like you're talking about the concept of bias. But yes, Jason Lee Bias is, yeah.
My bad. Yes. It's actually funny. I had thought that their name was Bias, like Jason Lee Bias, for the entire time that I was writing it. Then I saw one of all of your guys' podcasts, and they had said his full name. I was like, wait a minute, oh my God. But one of my first issues when approaching his work was really figuring out, what morality is in sort of an abstract, non-specified state. Like, Jason has sort of his ideas that he lives for with, I think it's various, I forgot the word that it was, virtues. I kept wanting to say values, virtues. I'm sort of more of a virtue ethicist approach, I guess. But then, that's not the only way to think about it, and saying, and then so when you get into a conversation of, what morality is and isn't, it gets caught down in the weeds. I guess if what I tried to approach then, sort of the approach that I took, was morality as a fixed thing of not just, what I find good or enjoyable in the moment, but what is always good, always, absolutely so. Essentially, a focus, I sort of relied on a sense of Stirnerian alienation of, it's not just, this virtue is not just what I find virtuous for the moment. It is a virtue in and of itself, that I can take on. Or it creates, or the virtues that I already have create a fixed path that I must then walk, without, variation. And so when looking at Stirner and sort of the question of the value judgments that he's raising, I think that's the divide that I would take on, is that he's not placing down any fixed or static values that you must take on or that you must find interesting. What you find interesting today might not be what you find interesting tomorrow, or you might be absolutely just bedazzled with one idea or one way of thinking for a huge long amount of time. There's this one discourse among at least some of the Stirnerians that I have talked to, on sort of almost a kind of Stirnerian philosophical suicide of just one self-conscious egoist who is just completely smitten with one particular idea and almost resembling the kind of fixity we see among non-Stirnerians, or what we accuse them of. I guess if that approaches your question at all.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think this might be a good point I want to read a passage from Jason's essay, but also, note that I think this distinction gets made in other areas as well, with morality being the universal version and ethics being, what do we do in a particular instance? And one of the things we will get into in a moment is, so we had originally talked about organizing this around religion and egoism and Stirner on religion. And so I do want to get more explicitly into that. But I think a nice tie-in here is that what we're talking about as morality, as fixed morality, as universal morality, is something that I guess Stirner and Stirnerites would say people have a religious devotion to, right? This fixed universal view of morality as this is always correct, plays into some of his ideas on religion, religious devotion, and the making of making things sacred, whether that is God or our virtues or what have you. And so I think that kind of gets to the heart of this debate between the moralists and the amoralists, right? Is this idea you were just talking about with fixity? Is it a fixed thing? Is it something that you're religiously devoted to? Or is it something that you have considered and like right now and would reconsider if things changed or if your mind changed, right? So all of that said, and I'm sorry, this is a favorite topic of mine, so I'm going to talk a lot more than I usually do during these interviews.
That's totally fine.
Okay.
I mean, I'm also the one rambling, so it goes both ways.
I'm supposed to be hosting, but All of that said, so I'm going to read this passage from Jason's essay Against Moral Cannibalism. This is the very end. And this is where he kind of defends the Stirnerite view, from the position of a moralist, right? So he says, yet it is exactly the kind of answer that we need to have, the answer that amoralists are seeking. It must be a defect in the amoralist reasoning, and they must have a reason to accept morality's claims, even if it's a reason they can't see. Morality must speak to them in their own voice, even if they refuse the call. Morality is a realm of reasons. To answer the amoralist is to show why that realm is inescapable, why there is no perspective from which we can stand back and declare the whole thing nothing more than a deranged power game. Some ways of mapping out that realm will suggest it is all-pervasive. Others will not. Thus, the amoralist challenge will also help us in figuring out what morality looks like. Because whatever it's like, it cannot be a system of moral cannibalism, by which the interests of some are simply sacrificed to the interests of others without any further justification. That is why, while I reject Stirner's conclusions, I think the kind of challenge he offers is the most foundational question of ethics. It cannot be ignored. So I wanted to read that point where he agrees that it's useful to sort of go through this thought process that Stirner leads us on. And I think this quote really, exemplifies what is useful about Stirner and egoists, Stirnerites, whatever we want to call them, to moralists as well. And it does kind of also, though, exemplify the problem that you were bringing up earlier, where morality needs this Stirnerite questioning to be mapped out. If we sit down and try to just say, okay, what is morality? Even a moralist like Jason Lee Bias is sitting here and saying, well, I'm not really sure, and it's actually useful to have the Stirnerite questioning of what exactly I mean here. And so I guess we can kind of take a step back from this question of what is morality, which I think gets to the center of, the moralist and amoralist disagreement. But in Stirner's terms, right, a lot of this is talked about as being akin to religion, if not the same as religion, right? These people are religiously devoted to humanism, to philosophy, to whatever concept. And so the next question I want to ask is, what does Stirner mean, when he accuses his contemporaries and even the, clear atheists of thinking religiously? I guess what is at stake when Stirner's talking about religion?
So similar to what I had said earlier about us having to really figure out what we mean when we use a word like morality, religion too, both during Stirner's time and after, has taken on a variety of different meanings. And there's a lot of different ways that we can interrogate it and really question what we're talking about when we say it. At least in my reading, the kind of meaning that Stirner is talking about when he says religion is almost a sense of devotion. He uses the words sacred and sacramental and profane, oftentimes in relationship to Christianity and Catholicism, mainly to focus on that sort of prescribed and immutable importance that we assign to particular ideas. You have to think about, like I said earlier, you have to think about God or the religious teachings or the Bible in a particular way. There's a kind of emotional state that you are expected to enter into, which he challenges through humor. And so when he, for example, goes on to challenge Feuerbach or Bruno Bauer or the other young Hegelians and accuse the atheists there of being pious atheists, what is essentially saying is that even if their ideas are not God but have been secularized, they're humanism or Bauer's free state or what have you, he is essentially accusing them of thinking about their ideas in the same way, with this sort of perspective of devotion, of inherent importance, of sacredness.
Yeah, and I guess reverence seems like the right word. Seems like another right word to me. Reverence,
absolutely,
for these things. And yeah, so I guess the claim from even atheists who are moralists is that this sort of religious devotion, even in service of non-religious ideals, right? This reverence, this holding things sacred, is what makes us good people, or is what allows us to become good people. And so you actually have a really great answer to Jason's challenge around this. So one of the things that Jason brings up in his essays is the existence of this Stirnerite James Walker, who defended the murder of Chinese migrant workers, called himself variously, I guess, an anarchist and a Stirnerite, an individualist anarchist and a Stirnerite. And so Jason kind of points to this as what we get if we don't have morality within anarchism. And so one of the things I think you did really well in your essays was sort of answer that specific charge. And so I'm wondering if we can get into that a little bit, why religious devotion to some ideal is not necessary, to avoid this outcome.
Yeah, that was one that I actually had to spend a lot of time thinking about, because it's a difficult claim to make, because not only are we saying, we're not only defining what is good and what is bad, which a Stirnerian would push back against, we're also then saying that in order to have any strong relationship to an idea at all, that strong relationship, those strong feelings must be fixed, devotional, reverent. And so one thing that I really tried to push back against was a sort of a too fixed or narrow understanding of the kinds of relationships that we can have to ideas. I believe I had mentioned in the first essay that I had written that I can have my ideas change with every sunrise, or I could be a staunch old guard communist until the day I die. And neither of those things inherently challenges my own self-conscious egoism. But even beyond that, I had also tried to tie in, I guess, the problematic aspects of old anarchist thinkers. Kropotkin sided with Russia in World War I. Proudhon was a vicious misogynist, and I also believe an anti-Semite. I think Bakunin was an anti-Semite too. I could be wrong. And my main point was, if these great thinkers, these titans in sort of the zeitgeist of anarchism, also were just humans who had problems and had wildly ridiculous ideas, by our standards. My counter question to Jason Lee Bias was, were they not devoted enough? Like, were they just not anarchist enough? Was that really the problem? And my, I guess, counter to, can we be good from this moralistic perspective was that moralism doesn't actually provide us the solution either. My devotion to a thing doesn't actually prevent me from being sinful, which is one of the main points that, Stirner brings up when it comes to involuntary egoism, is that, these ideals that we present to ourselves are ideals, and we are not our ideals. It's always going to be this alien thing that we're chasing after. And so I guess the point that I had set out to make was that an egoist can do all of the things that a moralist can do, and the solutions to the problems that moralism is bringing up aren't actually solutions to the problems that it's challenging.
Yeah, so I think another way of thinking about this, is if everything is universal, it's sort of an appeal to tradition in a way. And, whether we're looking back at anarchists or other folks who have established systems of morality, most of them have been bad in some ways, or at least not what we would like them to be. And so, yeah, I guess the next place I want to go from here is following this idea of religion, religious devotion. One of the things that Stirner gets accused of is putting that sort of devotion on the self, right? On the unique. And I think it's worth talking about, there's two ways of interpreting the Stirnerite view of the self. One is we are sinful and horrible all the time, and we should just accept that we're in goblin mode, right? And the other is that we are literally gods. And so let's get into that a little bit. Does Stirner mean us to see ourselves as gods? And what does that mean if he does?
Don't be alarmed. It's only a laser sword fight. Don't be scared. It's only the Death Star destroying another world. Relax. It's only...
The best way to spend Mardi Gras! Come join C4SS and Crew Domain for a carnival celebration you'll never forget. 1 part Anarchist Book Fair and Unconference and 1 part Cultural and Arts Festival, Coup de Gras features guest speakers, live music, drag, stand-up comedy, parades, an agorist market, and so much more. Join us February 17th to 22nd, 2023 at Fontainebleau State Park. Visit coupdegras.wtf for more details. That's COUPDEGRAS.WTF.
Does Stirner mean us to see ourselves as gods? And what does that mean if he does?
The phrase "God," we should all just go goblin mode was very fantastic. So believe it or not, I have also been I've been thinking about sort of the religious aspect to Stirner in relation to Stirner for a while, and this notion. In my first essay, I had said something along the lines of pushing back. I believe Jason Bias had made the argument that he was going to pose a question that Stirner was not bold enough to answer. Are we like God? And I had wanted to push back and say, like, that is literally Stirner's point. But as I had wrote that, and I was sharing it with a friend of mine who's also an avid Stirnerian, he had also brought up sort of the problematic notion of saying that we are like God, or that we. He said more that he I think he would agree with you in saying that we almost position ourselves as almost a God figure. But one of my problems with that is the same thing that he had of his problem with the phrase "like God," is God is a particular concept. It's a particular, God has a particular relationship to his properties. I think Stirner is definitely referencing that in sort of calling himself all in all, of almost saying, I am my world, not just my tiny little body, but also all of the experiences that I'm having and my feelings on those experiences and the values that I assign to them. And it's a very me-centric worldview, which, in my opinion, sometimes is helpful, sometimes is not. Within his framework, this sense that I am literally the center of my world, in that I am what is assigning values. I am creating my experience by creating myself in every second, is very much so. Even going back to his phrase, the creative nothing. I am the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I create all things as creator, he is very much, or at the end of the book, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, they say that of God no names name him, that is true of me alone. He is definitely making these allusions and connections to almost a self-perception, almost like a divine self-perception. I think the danger comes in seeing that as because I just said, like, God is a particular concept. And one thing that I tried to push back against in The Nothing was this notion of having, a fixed self-conception at all, of these particular views that we can develop about ourselves, these different ways that we have of looking at ourselves, are also themselves just ideas that we can, pick up and put down as interest us. They too are not sacred. And so I guess one of the difficulties that I have in approaching a question like this, and which is the reason why I have been thinking about it so much, is because on the one hand, it asks us, are we supposed to think about ourselves in a particular way, while also talking about someone who explicitly argued that every way that we think about ourselves is inherently wrong. So I guess my answer is almost a kind of yes and no.
Yeah, like it depends on which aspects of the concept of God we're talking about, right? Some of them yes, some of them no.
Yes.
And this is where it gets, very interesting to me personally, right? Is I am someone who does experience religious devotion that, I would say is chosen and has to do with, I guess very early you said something about Stirner when he talks about religion and religious devotion is mostly looking at privation, at the denial of the self, right? It's mostly looking at things that we do contra our own wishes. It's anti-jubilation and all of that. And so this is something I had as a question further down, but religious devotion to jubilation, to the profane, to change. What do we think about that? And I think one of the ways to sort of frame this is in reference to Taoism, which we think might have had some historical influence on Stirner himself. And so I guess the question I want to ask here is, can religion exist without these transcendent universal ideals, virtues, fixed ideas? Or in other words, is Taoism a religion? And maybe if you can, whatever you know about Taoism's influence on Stirner, I think would be interesting to get into here.
Yeah. I had just said, oh God, specifically because I've encountered back in my undergraduate days, I had encountered, anthropologies of religion. And so the reason why when we had first started talking about religion, I had specified that there's a lot of different meanings and ways that we can attribute to that word, and ways that we can interrogate that word, was specifically because I don't want to get locked into one particular meaning for it. I'm actually, as an aside, I'm really glad that I came into contact with Joseph Parampathu and Andrew Craig at this exchange when it comes to talking about Christianity and religion. Not necessarily because I agreed with them all that much, but because they got me thinking a lot about religion outside of the question of fixity. And so when it comes to something like Taoism, which I am hardly an expert in, I'll bring this up now. The one word that sort of kept coming up as I was thinking about this was numinous, or like numinosity, which is essentially like indicating or suggesting the presence of divinity. And I guess using Stirner to step out of the Western rational, empirical, scientific worldview, the secular humanist worldview, as itself sacred allows us to essentially answer your question of, can religion exist without transcendental ideals? I would say yes. Like we can, I can wholeheartedly believe in some form of divinity and also be a Stirnerian through and through, a conscious egoist through and through. Stirner really doesn't make a lot of claims, and also the arguments that he does make kind of prevents certain claims of what is and what is not true, or what is the proper way of seeing the world. Is that it's a challenge to that. And so it would be more, when it comes to sort of, I guess, religion and egoism, it's more a question of the relationship that I then take on to whatever ideas I have on the topic. Either devotion or meditation, or I guess numinous divine exploration, whatever that means for you, can be deeply egoistic, can be deeply self-interested. It is a practice, it's a thought that I find interesting. But I guess also Taoism. I have read the Tao Te Ching before. I have plans to read the Zhuangzi. There are absolutely connections there. I'm very hesitant to say that they absolutely definitely had an influence on Stirner, just because the historiography, the history itself, the biography of how Stirner wrote and what ideas he came into contact with, I'm not an expert in, but there are certainly connections between the eternal name that cannot be named, and then the unique who is nameless, or the eternal way that cannot be spoken or talked about, and the various forms of self-enjoyment and self-understanding that an egoist can take on. And so there are definitive connections there, and there is definitely a relationship to what I guess I'll call divine ideas for now that one can have. There's nothing in Stirnerian thinking that expressly denies any particular conception of how the world does actually work.
Well, and I guess this is similar to our earlier discussion about morality versus ethics and values, right? And that you say Stirnerian, I say Stirnerite, but either way, I'm going to keep saying Stirnerite. But if a Stirnerite might have values even without having morals. We'll have we'll make value judgments, and so this seems very similar to me. Even without fixed morality, we can say possibly something like divinity exists. And I'll just, before I ask this next question, plug to you and all of the listeners. John Roussan has a book called Bearing Witness to Epiphany, which I think does a great job of laying out sort of laying out a phenomenological approach. I hate saying that word, to, the experience of divinity in others, and specifically the erotic in the philosophical sense, right? That others' otherness is what is important about them. And there's a lot of overlap, I think, with Stirner's thinking there.
Actually, just as you had said it, so I'm sorry to cut you off, but that phrase,
no, go for it.
The experience of divinity, is exactly the articulation that I was looking for in my previous ramblings. In the sense of, if we're looking at religious experience as something that's very vivid and lived and embodied, whatever that experience is, Stirner does not have the power, and also does not set out to deny those experiences. And so in that sense, I can wholeheartedly have a divine experience. I personally have not. I personally am an atheist. But that does not mean that I must now thereby, deny wholeheartedly the experiences that others are having, and their consuming of those experiences, the values that they then produce from them, and their enjoyment of the divine is wholeheartedly an aspect that I would actually I think it'd be really interesting to see explored.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm now thinking about having a religious experience like unwrapping a granola bar. So thank you for that image. And with that, I kind of want to flip over to the other side of this. So we've been doing a lot of comparing, contrasting the Stirnerian egoist view with the moralist view. On the other side, there are a lot of nihilists who claim Stirner, who overlap with egoism. And I think it's worth addressing here because it's so often made as an accusation of Stirner himself, of followers of his, that egoism is this sort of like worship of chaos or void, that it is, nihilism. And I think it's worth asking what distinguishes this approach from just, full nihilism and the retreat into, non-thinking chaos.
So that is a difficult question. I personally, I have encountered a lot of nihilist writings with Baden, Serafinsky, at least in the anarchist nihilist tradition. I had read Aragorn, Nihilism in the 21st century, 20th century. I'm just at 21st, 20th century, and so I guess interrogating that phrase of what is meant by nihilism might be in order, because it truly does take on just an absolutely enormous amount of meanings. You had mentioned this phrase like worship of chaos or void. I guess it depends on what we mean by void and chaos. If we look at Stirner from an almost nihilistic perspective in the sense of negation and creating a negative critique, he is certainly creating a negative critique, essentially pointing out that all of the conceptions of what I am are wrong, and then he does not then really give me a new conception. He gives me a word, the unique, the creative nothing, but then immediately says, later clarifying in Stirner's Critics and the Philosophical Reactionaries, but also if you read through The Uniqueness Property, it's very obvious there, that, these words don't really mean anything. They don't carry any thought content to replace myself with, because I am not only a thought. And so in that sense, I would say that he's nihilistic in that I don't have, or I through him, I cannot really create any inherent meanings or concepts of what I am or what is going on. Worship is definitely a dangerous word when it comes to Stirner, because it then goes back to that sense of fixity and devotion and reverence that you and I were talking about when we were talking about morality and religion. As its distinguishment from nihilism, I feel like I would be wrong in any way I kind of answer that question, because there's probably if we're looking at moral nihilism, I've seen ideas that are very similar to Stirnerian. If there is no inherent morality, can we go down, the Camusian route of Camusian? I have no idea. Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, going down that route of, and exploring the world through quantity rather than quality. Or we can go down more existentialist route of, if there's no fixed morality, then we can create whatever values that we want. Stirner, I think he is unique, not necessarily in claiming, I guess when it comes to, say, looking at moral nihilism, for example, there is no morality. Stirner would be different from that approach, not in the sense that he would say that there is a morality, but almost in the sense that he doesn't care. I had put this in one of my footnotes, I think in my part of my response to Andrew Craig, was that, even if there is a God, we would not necessarily be forced to conclude fixed Christian teachings or that specific form of religious experience. And that's what that I think is going to be my answer here is, even if, the moral realists in the correct, and there is some objective notion of what is good, that doesn't actually challenge what Stirner is saying, because then the next question is, what is my relationship to that good? How is it good for me? And so we can still come to all of the same conclusions that we would otherwise. I guess so that would be really the difference, that he's not actually claiming that he is not I don't necessarily think that he's claiming that nothing is there. I mean, he kind of sort of is. He's making that assumption. But his main argument is against the relationship that we would have to it, even if it were there. And even if it is there, that does not change his conclusion of conscious egoism.
Interesting. Okay. So it's less about whether or not there is something out there. It's about our like you said, our relationship to it. Yeah, because like I said, this is, I think, the critique that I see the most often, is that, you've just replaced regular morality with this sort of inverted version of it, which, yeah, it's sort of beside the point for Stirner. So, yeah, I guess with that, we are getting up there in time, and so earlier we talked a little bit about this quote that I read from Jason Lee Bias's essay on morality and reasons, right? And appreciating the egoist approach in that it forces the moralist to come up with, good reasons for whatever virtues or moral laws. And so earlier, I think you said you had something you wanted to say in response to this. Do you want to go back to that?
So that quote that you had mentioned from Jason Lee Bias, one of the lines that I kept bringing back up again, that I kept mulling over, was "Speak to us in our own voice." And he does really bring up this interesting line of thinking to respond to, I guess, the problem that amoralism challenges. If morality is a system of reasons, it too needs a reason to exist. If morality requires a particular relationship to the particular moralist, that relationship also needs to have a reason. The response that I then, I guess, took to this is similar to the response that I took to the point that we had talked about earlier, James L. Walker's racism, and what I had mentioned with Kropotkin's supporting Russia, or Proudhon's misogyny and anti-Semitism, is that the moralist solution to moralist problems don't actually solve those problems. In attempting to speak to us in our own voice, if we allow the Stirnerian to come out in Jason Lee Bias's logic, it causes his argument to really twist around itself. For example, a main idea that I got from his writing was, a need for permanence. I have this virtue that I create, and he wanted to demonstrate that egoism can create virtue too. And from that virtue, I then construct a path that I must walk. And one thing that I wanted to first point out was that, racism is a virtue for the racist. It is also, a moral claim of what's right and wrong, except what's right and wrong are, statements of racial superiority and inferiority, of violence and authority, which, yeah, obviously, like from my perspective, not a great call. That's not good, but it's still, at least how I see it, the same fixity, the same claims of what is sacred and what is important. And so here, in attempting to speak to the amoralist, or in this case, speak to a Stirnerian as a Stirnerian, the problem that the line of thinking that Jason Bias is putting forward immediately comes up against is that it tumbles to the ground. If I am impermanent, if I can create that good anarchist virtue, that's not the only virtue I can create. I can create a variety of different virtues. And that virtue itself, that anarchist virtue, is not fixed and can mutate and evolve, and has mutated and evolved. The anarchism of Proudhon is very different than the anarchism of Kropotkin, and both of their anarchisms is different from the anarchism that we're seeing today. It's also very similar, but change and mutation even within an idea is still active. And so I guess the main point that Jason Bias wanted to explore was, how can we make the amoralist or the Stirnerian, how can we fix them in place just like a moralist, or how can we at least expect that of them, falls immediately on its face. I can create that pathway that he wants me to create. I need not do so. And so the reasoning that he wanted to put forward, that he wants to speak to us in our own voice, he's not actually doing. The relationship that he wants me to have to my ideas still remains mine.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a great point to sort of put on it, and a very, individualist anarchist point. My relationship to my ideas is mine. There's nothing you can do about it. And it's, I think one of the central problems for social activists in general, right, around all sorts of things, is other people are other people. They're not us. They do their own thing. They think their own thing. And it's one of the things I see as being really beautiful coming out of egoism, is this idea that, you yourself are deeply free in your own mind in a way that is, I would say metaphysical, right? Insurmountably free in our own minds. But yeah, I had one other sort of side question about a common misinterpretation, or what I see as a misinterpretation in Stirner's writing, and that was around the question of anti-Semitism, and I put in /philosemitism/allosemitism. Did you have anything particularly to say on that? Did you want to talk about that one?
I can. I can have some things to say on that. You had mentioned that you were both Jewish and also more on the Stirnerian side. So I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on this topic. Approaching anti-Semitism in Stirner is both, at least in my experience, very easy and also very hard. Because he pulls on, objectively speaking, completely. I have no doubt in my mind. You should definitely want to say what I'm saying. Definitely take what I'm saying as absolute fact. He pulls on a huge variety of anti-Semitic stereotypes, common to, the German general region. Germany had not formed yet, I don't think. He'd written in 1844. No, it was formed like a year later. But in sort of that German area, anti-Semitism was rife. It was a huge and very normal idea of either the specific anti-Semitic movement of the time, but also of just, anti-Jewish sentiment and thinking. And that does show up in his writing. He draws, conclusions that it is more primitive than Christianity, that it is, or that it is, I'd have to go back into the actual book to see the specific targets that he's making towards Jewish people. The difficulty for me comes is mainly first in approaching, how it is that he's critiquing them, and how it is that he's critiquing or Judaism or his anti-Semitic comments when contextualized with his very anti-Christian comments and his anti-liberal comments, anti-communist, he takes on Fichte, so even anti-individualist comments. They are very similar. He ties in, and we can also tie this into the question of racism in Stirner's work, particularly in the hierarchy. There's one of the sections in The Uniqueness Property, uses viciously racist terminology. But in both of those cases, the way he characterizes Judaism and the way he characterizes Africa and Asia are in line with how those different ideas, I believe, are characterized among the young Hegelians and also among Hegel. The hierarchy itself, I believe, was a parody of Hegel's treatment of race. And so it's I guess it's almost a question for me of like, to what extent did he actually was he actually anti-Semitic, and also to what extent that matters? Because even if he was just, parodying Hegel in using that racist terminology to, I guess, make the opposite point Hegel was making, or even if he's just, using the language of the young Hegelians as regards Judaism, those are still racist remarks. It's still anti-Semitic. So there is a lot to be said there. And it's also, it's difficult to comment on because he's not necessarily stepping outside of the framework that he's critiquing. His main style of criticism is parody and is, twisting the words of his enemies against them. One of the really famous lines from the philosophical reactionaries is, watch how the philosophers turn black into white and white into black, how I dialectically demolish what they dialectically put up. Essentially it's Stirner just, revving the engine until it explodes. And so I don't have any particular conclusions on it. I want definitely to acknowledge that it's there. But I want to point out that it's potentially it's a nuanced topic that we could get into when it comes to approaching Stirner and his writings.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that hierarchy passage, because I tend to agree that a lot of the on-face anti-Semitic things said in Ego in its own read to me as the same kind of parody as is happening in that hierarchy passage, where he's using this insanely racist language of the milieu that he's talking to in a way to show how ridiculous it is. And it's interesting. I put it as, / maybe philosemitism. The term allosemitism means both, like the treatment of Judaism as different from all other religions and, deserving of being treated different either positively or negatively. And so it does seem like he does that, which might be an artifact of the time at which he's writing. But it's interesting where I see this come up there are some passages where he's absolutely going to task against Christianity, and how Christian society works. And then he says something like, well, and the Jews are almost as bad, but they're not quite as bad. And honestly, on a personal level, right? So that is my practice, like you mentioned, and it is weird to try and match that with egoism. But I think one of the areas in which, it sort of does make sense, and this is one of the things that Stirner sort of points out, is like, there's not a requirement to believe there's a requirement around practices, around participation in community in certain ways. There's not necessarily a requirement that you in your heart and brain believe a certain thing. And so that, I think, is the area that sort of makes it tenable to me for these things to go together, right? There's also this tradition of questioning and debating and deciding on your own about things, which I think, Christianity, especially at the time that Stirner is writing, probably was worse in terms of saying you have to believe it this way. And, this was when different sects of Christianity were still killing each other, right?
You had mentioned that one phrase. I have only intermittently come into contact with Judaism, as a philosophy and a religion and a theology. But even within it, the term debating God, or the really rich history of debate between various figures in the Jewish community over thousands of years. I would agree with you when you sort of said that there is plenty within the Jewish tradition that a Stirnerian could pull from.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me to read some of these passages and wonder what he actually thought about that. Because like I said, there's somewhere it's like absolutely eviscerating Christian society, and then it's like at least the Jews have different ideas from one to the next. But yeah, I think that's probably all we need to say about that. I have sort of one final big question.
Well, I will bring up one thing before we move on.
Yeah, go for it.
I had mentioned when talking about sort of the potential anti-Semitism or the actual anti-Semitism, and then the racism in Stirner's works, to what extent that matters. Not in the sense of like, oh yeah, we definitely need to overlook it, but more like whether or not he believed it. That's still there in his writings, and it still influences how we read him. I think the most Stirnerian thing that one could do, if they want to still pull from Stirner, is deliberately, parody him back. One thing that was in the back of my mind when we were talking about this was the ways in which, I had mentioned, I believe towards the beginning of our conversation, the sort of conceptual universe that Stirner puts out, this whole language that he sets up, the system of thought, is not in and of itself valid, and we can loot from it as we are interested, and we can mutate it too and change it too. Some of the terms are useful, some of the terms aren't. Some of the aspects of his thinking are enjoyable, some of them aren't. And so going at him from the perspective of theft, of mutation and change is definitely something that I would think would have to underpin at least a Stirnerian approach to those, I guess, more problematic aspects of his writing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, that, continuing the cycle. Okay, so I have one last big question I wanted to ask, that I think is relevant to sort of all anarchists looking at this, is that a lot of the critiques come back to this idea of like laziness, right? And if we're saying that, an egoist should abandon anarchism if it fails to provide for our ends or hold our interests, is this not a cop-out to answering hard philosophical questions, to taking difficult political actions? I do feel like, as someone who likes egoist ideas a lot, one of the dangers that seems relevant even to me is that it would be easy to, sit at home and be cozy and, not be on a picket line or be doing other things that are difficult. And I guess the question is, why, what reason, does an egoist have to not, just be a puddle of hedonism all the time?
I like that phrase, a puddle of hedonism. Yeah, I had attempted to approach this in a couple different ways throughout my works. And throughout my works, I'm a published author. The first two essays that I had written, because there's a lot of ways that you can look at this. I think the first point, I had first attempted to approach this by saying, that the moralist approach doesn't actually solve the problem of, how are we good anarchists, but also I wanted to try and look at anarchism as a conclusion that we can draw from Stirner. There are huge overlaps in how he looks at associations and how he looks at fixed ideas. The ideas we see within Proudhon with absolutism and the polity form, and then you obviously have Stirner's influence on the post-left, on insurrectionalism, on some nihilists, on the 60s milieu in the U.S. Yeah, at least in the U.S. And so there's a lot to go in there. When it comes to, I guess, the question of laziness, Stirner really forces us to look at, and I tried to get into this in my second essay. I don't know how well I did it, but Stirner forces us to really question how it is that we get interested in things and to begin with. He forces us almost to look at it from the perspective of a social theory of where within society, like how is it that an idea like anarchism even comes to be? One thing that I had mentioned the term contradiction a lot, in terms of, like social struggle and locating in society and sort of, I guess pulling on, my own background in Marx a little bit, and materialist thinkers within anarchism, the Neo-Proudhonian project with, Sean Wilber. You have, essentially it's a question of where and how emancipatory ideas form, where they come from, and how we, I guess, stick to them. With a Stirnerian, I tried to really emphasize that, I could change my ideas with each sunrise, but I also keep the ideas that I have until like the end of time. Like it depends on my relationship to them. One of the difficulties with language like interest and self-interest is that there is sort of like a preconception of fickleness, of weakness in your beliefs, which I tried to really push against in my second essay. And in even outside of Stirner, you have ideas like with, I believe it was Baden, like with jouissance, and with I think it was in Serafinsky's work with messianic time. And looking at struggle as something that's just electrifying, that's engaging, and essentially locating the reason to struggle in the fact that one is struggling oneself. Every day under archaic society, under capitalism, we face oppression and exploitation. And so for every, to loosely use the word injustice, for every injustice, for every wrong committed against us, for everything wrong we find in our daily lives, every mundanity and every pain, there are that many reasons to then get motivated. And so I guess it's less of a question of like what reason would an egoist have to give a damn, and more how and why do we get motivated in the first place?
Yeah, no, and I like that there has been a lot more attention paid to that sort of joy of rebellion lately. Peter Gelderloos is someone who has written as well about the experience, right, of taking space, of being in the streets, of all of these things. And yeah, I mean, it's I think I can say personally that it is more about the way that feels that ultimately motivates my decisions to like be part of actions that are uncomfortable or potentially dangerous, or things that might not appear to be in the self-interest, in my self-interest. There is this sort of inherent joy of rebellion that, yeah, I guess makes a lot of sense as something that is behind the motivation of a lot of anarchists, other political radicals as well.
And even beyond just like joy as one potential relationship that we could have to rebellion, I still to look at empathy as an experience. Most recently with the railroad strike that is being beaten to death here in the U.S. by our glorious and just government. As a Stirnerian, I am enraged by that. I want to see the strikes. I want to see the pushback. There's, I am feeling, empathy with other exploited people, even though I'm not a railroad worker. I'm not exploited in that way, but I can still foster an experience of solidarity in a way that, the idea of just, it could be easy to just, sit back and rely on the privileges that I have, but I can't quite shake that scruple, that, that sense of, this is wrong. I despise this. Which was actually that was another reason why I found approaching Jason Lee Bias's work so difficult because I do have values. I do have things that I would find virtuous that I am not constantly changing. I do have experiences of right and wrong. And so, then going back to one of the first questions you had asked, like, what is morality? That's why I found it so difficult. But I guess here it's all of those experiences of solidarity and of experience of exploitation or oppression, or of seeing the world as you sound very edgy, but seeing the world as wretched. A Stirnerian does that too. We still experience these things, and so we still have the ability to form long-standing beliefs and ideas and long-standing stances.
No, I think that's a really great counter and an important one, that interest is not just seeking of joy, and interest is not just pleasure. Interest is interest. It's like you said, solidarity, it's empathy, it's all of these other things as well. And yeah, it's through our experience, I guess an egoist would say, of the wretchedness. It's not sitting back in our armchair and saying, well, according to this moral precept, that's an injustice. It's the seeing it happen and feeling what it's like to see it happen. That
point exactly is, I guess that goes back to, how, the moralist approach doesn't actually solve that problem, is, me saying academically, or me like making the claim of, an absolute right or wrong doesn't actually necessarily motivate me to take action. And so even within the moralist, like I can still sin, I can still be immoral, I can still fail. And what you had said, I really loved what you had said about, bringing in self-interest. I kept really reiterating the phrase in my essays. My interest is what I find interesting, in order to push back against the idea of self-interest or my interest as another fixed idea, as another, this idea has a particular meaning that is attributed to it. And this is the thing that you should pursue, which is just not how Stirnerians really think about interest at all.
Nice. All right. Well, so anything else you want to say about Stirner on religion, morality, philosophy? I have a quick fun question after this, but anything more serious you want to say now?
I think we touched on most of the things that I really wanted to touch on, religion or racism or philosophy. There's always going to be the ability for me to talk for hours on this subject. I am very interested in Stirner academically, and beyond just my actual beliefs and I guess more joyful interests. A sort of a more academic approach. I am very much so invested in him. So I don't really have much else to add without spiraling into another 2-hour long discussion.
Yeah, no, and it's great to see that people are taking Stirner, maybe more seriously is the wrong word, but thinking and talking more about Stirner in academia and in an academic sense is nice to see. I really appreciate that. But the last sort of fun question we ask people on these is, what book would you have all of our listeners read? You mentioned, we've mentioned a couple throughout, but if there's something, you haven't mentioned yet that you think everyone should read, what would that be?
Well, this is actually a very it's a really funny question. I had mentioned at the first of my essays that Jason Bias is making the same problems that we've seen with people who approach Stirner since his inception, and I really meant that as I had made like an allusion, like a connection between him and Feuerbach and essentialism. When it comes to Stirner, even if you don't agree with him, and even if you want to do everything in your power to prove him wrong, read Stirner's critics. He goes phrase by phrase, like talking about like really getting into the nitty gritty and very plain language of what it is that he's talking about and sort of the problems with different misinterpretations of his era with his works. And it's out there. It's a really good resource. And if you're reading, The Unique in Its Property for the first time, reading critics also is always very useful. On that note, for those who are interested in The Unique in Its Property, I and a co-writer of mine are currently working on a new edition to The Unique in Its Property that we're going to be that we're currently in the process of developing, comparing the Wolfie Landstreicher translation with the original German. We have managed to get our hands on a digital copy of the 1844, the original version published in 1844, and I think the third edition published in 1901. And we are in the process of comparing those two editions in terms of in terms of italicization, in terms of the Hegelian terminology that is in Stirner's work and how Landstreicher's handled that. We are working on the actual organization of the table of contents and the different passages in it. And so for those who are interested in the next, I don't really know when it's going to be out and how long that's going to take, but that is actually in the works, which I guess I'll, do a selfish plug of the project that I am working on.
Very cool. Yeah. So where should folks look out for that?
We are currently figuring out ways to get it published. Our current plan is to release our edition of The Unique in Its Property, including Philosophical Reactionaries and Stirner's Critics, alongside a German-English interlinear version that we're going to be releasing for free as PDFs online. We've been mulling over different places that we're going to be releasing them and, where that would be possible. And then also getting into contact with friends of ours who know how to self-publish and to then create an actual physical copy for this coming edition. So I guess keep an eye out of that on Reddit or Twitter, or I guess wherever the Stirnerians are, rattle.me. I don't really know. But yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I will so I just keep thinking about something you said earlier about vibing. And yeah, the question of where do you find other egoists? What's happening in the egoist world? And it's like, I don't know, feel out the vibes. So maybe on this too, pay attention to the vibes. But all right. Yeah. Thank you so much, for joining me today. I obviously really love talking about Stirner and egoism and all of this stuff. So I had a lot of fun, and I hope you did too. Any final thoughts before I stop the recording?
Thank you so much for having me on here. This was a lot of fun. It was really interesting to hear your perspectives when you had mentioned, your own relationship with religion. I think when we were contacting earlier, I got really excited about that because that's an idea that I'd already started thinking about as I came into contact with C4SS, and so it's been a really enjoyable experience to be allowed on. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening to this edition of Mutual Exchange Radio. And thanks as well for your patience during the recent gap in episodes. We've been figuring out some changes, but we expect to be back on track from here forward. For one, we've welcomed back Zachary Woodman as a host. You can look out for his interview with Jason Lee Bias very soon. And if you can't wait, you can hear Zach now on our Patreon-only roundtable show, The Outgroup. Our most recent episode covers the 2022 midterm elections and is available to patrons at any level. To support this show and hear that as well as other Patreon-only episodes, make a pledge today. You can find us at www.patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ssdotorg. Thanks!